Welcome to the New Chemist podcast. We're glad you're listening. Feel free to download this podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. Here on the New Chemist, we discuss chemistry, which simply put is the science of change, as well as the other sciences, careers, community, research, and COVID-19. Okay, Dr. Johansson, it is so good to have you on the podcast today. Welcome to the New Chemist podcast. We're glad you're listening. Feel free to download this podcast on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Odyssey, Stitcher, and a variety of other platforms. Here on the New Chemist, we discuss chemistry, which simply put is the science of change, as well as careers, community research, COVID-19. We discuss thesis, lectures, and we discuss people's careers in detail. So, we're happy you're tuning in. My guest today is Mattias Johansson. Thanks for joining me today. It is so good to hear from you. Just briefly, I'll inform my audience about you. So, Mattias is actually a colleague of mine. We taught at the same university. During my first time teaching, I got the opportunity to meet Mattias at the University of Bahamas. But Mattias is currently the assistant professor for small island sustainability at the University of the Bahamas, a field station coordinator with the University of Bahamas. He has served in roles such as an assistant professor with the biology department at the University of North Georgia in Gainesville. He has served as a research associate. And he also has his PhD in fisheries sciences with a specialty in genetics from Oregon State University, a Master of Science in Biology, a Bachelor of Science in Biology with marine emphasis. So Mattias is a very established, a very accomplished colleague of mine. So it's a pleasure to have him on the podcast today. So thank you
for having me, David. It's fun to be here.
Yeah. So Mattias, as we get started, what have been your long-standing interests in the field of science?
Well, my interests have really shifted kind of as I've learned more about the field, but the kind of through line that runs through it is genetics. I've been interested in genetics for a really long time, but when I was in high school and realized I wanted to do biology, I probably didn't really know what genetics was, but I discovered it as a real interest and as a love in college at Western Washington University. And my first kind of job in genetics, I don't remember if I was paid or if I was volunteer, to be honest, but I actually tutored other students in genetics at the invitation of my genetics professor. And since then, it's kind of been the thing that I've done in every kind of research role that I've had. Mostly it's been population genetics, which is kind of where we use genetic information extracted from individuals to understand the movement of populations or the connectivity between populations. But I've also done bits of stuff with genomics and identifying microbes and things like that. So a little bit of various. The nice thing about doing genetic work is that it doesn't really matter what the organism is. Once you get them back to the lab, you extract DNA from a little tissue sample, and the work from that point forward is more or less the same. So it's a very versatile set of tools as well, which is part of what excites me about it.
Oh, wow, that's good. So, for what I've seen so far in terms of genetics, it seems like genomics is like a hot topic, genomics, lipidomics, all those things, especially genomics. So what's your take on the introduction of genomic ideas or genomic concepts to undergrads? What's your take on that? How useful do you think that is? Or a little bit too detailed for them? What do you think?
No, I think it's really useful for students to know kind of that science is a developing field.
Uh-huh.
We should be pointing out to students where the cutting edge is and giving them the opportunity to kind of work there as much as we can in the undergrad situation.
Mm-hmm.
Genomics is a beautiful it's a beautiful tool for teaching undergraduates in that There are lots and lots of genomic resources. There's lots of genetic information available online for nothing. It's generally a requirement of publication that you make your data available publicly. And so anybody can go to, for example, the NCBI webpage and just find data on their organism of interest. And then we can use the tools, many of the tools that are developed for doing genomic analysis or genetic analysis generally are developed by other researchers to solve a problem. And if I build a tool to solve a problem that I have, why not make it available? In general, in science, nobody's out to make any money. So that's why we're scientists and not business people. So people make the tools available online, again, for nothing or for very nominal costs. So those are things we can have students download, and we can do very powerful genetic analyses with basically free resources. And, we can take students almost right out to the edge of at least the data analysis. The lab piece is a little trickier because resources, lab equipment is very expensive, and lab consumables cost money as well. They tend not to be very cheap either. So it's hard to do a lot, in the lab with classes. Although, many universities do introduce their students to very advanced genetic techniques in basic biology courses. So something we're working up to at the University of the Bahamas right now. At least UB North, we don't have those resources available to us just yet.
Yeah, I agree. So how do you maintain view of the bigger picture in your career and in your life in general? So how do you keep perspective? How do you stay optimistic? How do you stay hopeful when you face like challenges in your work or challenges in your personal life? What perspective allows you to maintain view of a big picture?
I mean, I guess I feel like I'm very lucky. I've been very lucky to this point, and I guess I don't expect that to change somehow. But I certainly, I don't know if I have a sort of overarching vision. I have kind of a philosophy of how I approach my job, and it's very service focused. I want to do the best I can when I prep a course, when I write a reference letter for a student, when I write a paper. I want it to be the best it can possibly be. And that is the through line, I would say, that kind of goes, carries my professional life forward. And there are certainly challenges. There are always difficulties, and there are always things that kind of knock you off course. But the reality is, I've tended always to land on my feet, or I feel like I've always landed on my feet. I graduated with my PhD kind of right into the tail end of the 2008 economic disaster. And that meant that jobs were hard to come by. So I ended up being a postdoc for much longer than I would have preferred. But I had really interesting opportunities and, learned a lot through that path. And I eventually found a job that I enjoyed very much. And then I found a job that, offered a bit more in terms of being, in the environment and actually being a marine scientist here at the University of the Bahamas. And as part of that job, I've also sort of discovered additional opportunities. There's lots of opportunity because there's lots of need, especially the university, the North Campus, UB North, was destroyed by Hurricane Dorian. And, as a result, we've got challenges, which means we have opportunities. And of course, coming through the pandemic, we've all sort of dealt with those challenges, but you can kind of turn that on its side, look at it a particular way, and you can see that, we can be teaching students very far away. We can be doing really cool stuff with virtual learning. It doesn't replace, certainly it doesn't replace the field, like the important parts of being in the field, but also we've had the opportunity to develop partnerships with various other agencies, both here in the Bahamas and outside the Bahamas, that I think are going to lead to some really cool stuff. So I generally just tend to be really optimistic, and that tends to carry me along.
Good. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, it's good to be optimistic or hopefully realistic. It's very good. So what have been your most creative or insightful ideas so far in the field of science? What ideas have you done, either in your research career or as serving as faculty, that has really been a source of inspiration to your students, or has been a really creative idea or an adaptive idea that you've implemented during your career as a scientist? What would you say? Would it be a research project? Would it be a dissertation? Would it be your work that you're doing now? What would you say has been really a hallmark of your creativity or your ability to adapt in science?
I mean, that's a challenging question, but I think I guess for me, the challenge of going through the pandemic and kind of realizing that I could still be of service to my student, that I could still I could still deliver a quality educational experience. Certainly, at the beginning of the pandemic, when I was at the University of North Georgia at the time, and I can still remember vividly. It's like I can't remember anything during lockdown vividly because none of us can, but I can remember vividly right before lockdown. We were about to go into spring break that March of 2020 or whatever it was, and we were talking about how this thing is overblown. It was Georgia, of course, and we probably didn't have the greatest wisdom about the whole situation, global picture. But the plan was we were going to go into, we were going to take an extra week of spring break. So spring break was going to be 2 weeks. That would give us time to adapt, and then we would be right back. And then 2 years later, we kind of find ourselves back in some form. And I spent the first week of that spring break essentially just mourning the loss of the job that I adored, because what I really enjoy is that interaction with students. But, that second week, I just got down to business and figured out, okay, I got to have some kind of product to deliver. And it felt like a real trial by fire, getting forced into this situation that nobody really wanted. I mean, certainly it was incredibly disruptive for all of us. But I felt like it went pretty well, and the students, the feedback that I got was generally quite positive. And I've kind of realized that that's a set of tools that I can continue to use, and that opens up these huge vistas of opportunity in terms of we could be teaching. The University of the Bahamas has 3 physical locations. One of them we really don't use for teaching. That's the Gerace Research Center. The 2 places we use for teaching are on 2 islands of 700 islands and keys. So, for many of the family islands, it is pandemic conditions all the time. They can't be in a classroom because there isn't a classroom, but we could be using these tools and delivering educational experiences, excellent educational experiences to students throughout the Bahamas or throughout the Western Caribbean, throughout the Western Atlantic rather, throughout the Caribbean. We need to be sort of recognizing the opportunity in these challenges, and that's something that really for me came out of the pandemic.
Wow, it's interesting that you consistently bring up the theme of basically capitalizing on the challenges or seeing the unmet needs as opportunities. Yeah, it's interesting you keep on bringing it up. So do you think that, I know that's easier said than done, but do you think that is something you've really done well during your time at UB? Would you say that's something you've done well so far?
I think it is. I think it is something. It's certainly, I wouldn't say that the job is done by any means.
Yeah. Oh, you're doing well.
It is certainly something I take pride in working toward and in kind of campaigning for.
Okay.
as I said at the beginning, I tend to be pretty optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of that is not getting ground down by frustrations and challenges, because the reality is life is full of frustration. Life is full of challenges. You know, any life is going to be full of setbacks. That's just how life works.
Mm-hmm.
Rarely do we have a perfectly linear path to greatness, and no one ever puts a stumbling block in our way.
Mm-hmm.
And being essentially being forgiving or being willing to forget the challenges is part of that, I think, but also recognizing that, okay, this challenge actually has a solution or might have a solution, and we should explore that. I think that's really important as well. Seeing that we do have agency in this world, and it's important to move things in a better direction as much as we can.
I agree.
So I think that's really my philosophical kind of perspective on life.
Yeah, that's good. So, how have you sought or found the right environment for you to thrive scientifically and intellectually? So what process did you go through as you went through finding your spot in graduate school, finding your spot, specifically for this question, finding your spot at University of North Georgia and then the Bahamas? What process or list or framework do you go through when you're trying to find a job or find a place for you to thrive scientifically and intellectually, however you want to phrase it?
The thing I find interesting about this question is when I communicate with students, this is one of those things I really try to communicate that I don't think they can absorb very well.
Okay.
Because students have this perspective that we essentially, as professionals in our field, whether we're scientists or whether we're doctors or whatever it is, we basically woke up one morning with a plan, and then we point by point went through the plan and arrived today in wherever we are.
Oh man, that's funny. That's funny. Yeah.
My experience has absolutely been a random walk.
Okay.
I have
Brownian motion.
Yeah. So I got out of. I knew that when I was in college, I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school, but I didn't have the wherewithal to talk to my advisor about how that actually worked. So I kind of fell out one end of college with a diploma in hand and no clue. So I worked at a dive shop for a while. I worked at Sears, and I kind of puzzled it out. And I emailed prospective advisors. I wanted to be a shark ecologist because everybody wants to be a shark ecologist, or a dolphin one, who's interested in marine science at least. And I actually sent an email to a guy who was then at the Moss Landing Marine Lab, Dr. Greg Kaye, and he told me he had 19 graduate students already, so he wasn't looking for any more. But he gave me a name. He said, "Have you contacted Ralph Larson at San Francisco State?" And I had never heard of Ralph Larson at San Francisco State. And he's not a shark guy. He's now retired, but he was a very effective teacher and a very productive rockfish, the genus Sebastes, which is a very speciose genus of fishes on the west coast of North America. He studied them for his career.
Okay.
And so I became a fish guy instead.
Okay.
But that gave me the opportunity to do genetics. I did a genetics project for my master's. So I got into fish, I got into genetics. And then, I had another opportunity at the University of California, Davis, where the timing just didn't work. So the opportunity kind of slipped out of my fingers. And when I threw that, they basically said, "Have you talked to Michael Banks at Oregon State?" And I said, "No, I've never heard of Michael Banks at Oregon State." But I sent Michael Banks an email and said, "Hey, I'm looking for a PhD opportunity." And he said, "We should talk." I landed at Oregon State, and that was an amazing opportunity. And then, when I graduated there, I did a little short postdoc at the Hatfield Marine Science Center, where I'd been based. And then I just applied for jobs that I saw online. And I ended up in Milwaukee at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, working in for a guy named Felipe Alberto doing population genetic work on giant kelp. And I learned to use R, and that was a valuable tool going forward. And then I ended up getting a postdoc position at the University of Windsor at the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research, or CLEAR. And I worked with two different guys, Hugh McIsaac and Dan. And what's Dan's last name? I can't remember Dan's last name.
That's all right.
So I worked with two guys, and I actually got into the field of invasive species ecology. And so I've kind of combined all these different things as I've gone along. And so now I would consider myself an invasive species ecologist as well as a population geneticist. And then when I was looking, all the while as I'm doing postdocs, I'm applying for jobs for faculty positions. And, you know, the offer that came through was from the University of North Georgia. And then that was a great position, and I really liked it, but it was principally teaching, and it was a marine biology faculty position, but it's 4 or 5 hours from the ocean. So, you know, I saw an ad for a job at the University of the Bahamas. That seemed like an exciting possibility. It was one of those, like, what if this happened? That'd be kind of funny. And then it did happen, and you have to puzzle out you have to figure out some logistics to move. So, and that's been a challenge for my family. My wife is now in Washington State, and it's not really ideal. But, you know, it really has been just kind of happenstance, and it's been making connections, making individual personal connections with people. And it really, the plan was to become a college professor, like way back, the plan was that. But the path to getting there has been anything but linear. And it's, you know, it's been as much chance as it has been my own powerful decision-making abilities.
I completely agree. Dude, you said a lot of things, which are very good. And see, the thing is, I don't think the path is linear, but I think the combination, in a sense, may be linear. You just have different weights on different experiences or different features. Like in MO theory, we talk about linear combinations, but anyway, I leave that right there. Also for R, I think, R is very useful because, you know, and there's also a program you could use if you're trying to learn R called Swirl. As well as you talk about UC Davis. It's interesting you bring up UC Davis. One of my mentors is actually in administration at UC Davis, you know, Chancellor May. He's a very good mentor of mine. So yeah, it's definitely very interesting stuff. And the thing that stands out to me as like a key feature in your story is strategically emailing people and not being afraid to email. I think sometimes we miss out on opportunities because we just don't take the shot. We just don't send the email, send it well, craft it well, let someone else read over it. But try, you know, there's nothing wrong with trying. And I've had that experience in which I've been able to meet new professors or get interviews or schedule job interviews or just develop my professional acumen and network through just emails. Having the opportunity to email and then meet people. So I think that's very, very important. I'm glad you shared that story. So how do you maintain vision and teamwork in your environment? How do you keep the collaborative spirit going where you work and what you do, even in your classroom? How do you keep that going?
In the classroom, it's a bigger challenge than otherwise. Undergraduates are, by their nature, shy and retiring somehow. I don't know. They're young enough that they still care what other people think. I think arriving in my mid-40s has been the principal blessing of getting older, is that you lose interest in what other people think. Because my students are they just don't want to put their head above the parapet. I require students to work together, of course. That's the main piece of leverage that we have as faculty members. But in my field, you know, or in my job, I reach out to colleagues and, you know, I make sure that people know what I'm up to and what I'm interested in. But another powerful tool is I basically don't say no to things. I don't say no when people ask me to help with something. And that opens up opportunities too. I mean, it does mean that your schedule gets busy, but a lot of requests are straightforward and very simple things that can potentially lead to other stuff. So I basically try to make myself available because I think, building those connections, building that network is, partly kind of that collegiality piece of what we do professionally. But it also is likely to lead to opportunities and ultimately to opportunities for our students.
Yeah. That's good. So do you have any advice for those wanting to pursue the field you're currently working in, Mattias? Do you have any advice for those who want to get involved in ecology or invasive ecology or population genetics or biology in general? What advice would you give them?
I mean, I guess your studies are super important. That's the first thing. Making sure that if you want to be successful in the field, you have to give it the time that it deserves. And a lot of our students, unfortunately, work. They have to contribute at home, or maybe they live on their own or whatever. But that definitely makes it much more challenging. So hopefully being able to focus helps. But making personal connections is another super important thing that I don't think students, the average student, I'll say, necessarily recognizes the importance of. So, a lot of students think if I just do my classes and I get decent grades, then opportunities are going to open up. But it's just easier for people to hire somebody they know. So, taking those outside opportunities, doing internships or volunteering. We're very lucky here in Grand Bahama to have lots of opportunities for our students and kind of more in the pipeline. The challenge that I run into is that the students don't see the value in it. They don't recognize that, by doing that internship at Company X, Company X is going to know who they are.
Yeah.
If they have a permanent position, the student's resume will say Company X on it, and it'll be easier to justify, if they've done a good job, of course, easier to justify hiring. And getting more diverse. I write lots of reference letters for students, and some students I can basically say the student was in my class and got a decent grade, but the CV or the transcript the university provides says exactly the same thing. It just doesn't have my signature at the bottom. So by having a reference letter that says, this student worked for our nonprofit marine science organization for a summer, did a fantastic job and did this task and this task and that task, and they were great with the kids and they were doing whatever. That sounds a lot better than the student took my ecology class and got an A-. Because who cares? Students get decent grades. The students who are being considered for jobs are going to have a reasonable GPA. So that isn't something you need a reference letter about. What you want reference letters to do is to say, a little bit more about you. And the way to get that is to take these opportunities as they're presented.
I agree.
That's been a challenge with my beloved students, unfortunately.
Yeah, I hear you, and I wish you all the best with that challenge. But I would say, classwork is almost like a local currency, and the experience allows you to basically convert that currency so that it's valuable to other people. So, what has been some of the most beneficial advice you have received? If you had to think back from either parents, professors, your spouse, what would be some of the most beneficial advice you have personally received in your career or in your life in general?
Well, I would say that I wouldn't even describe it as advice. It was just sort of my PhD advisor kind of telling me about myself.
Okay.
Because my interest is very strongly in teaching, and I enjoy research, but it doesn't give me the satisfaction that teaching does, and that really, at a lot of universities, that doesn't line up very well with the job of a professor. So at a lot of universities, these heavily research intensive universities, the job of a professor is to do research and secondarily to teach. But what I've found is that I need to be at a university where teaching is the primary focus, because that's where I get my energy from my job. That's what I love about the job.
Okay.
And that really was something that my PhD advisor, Michael Banks, pointed out to me, that you clearly love teaching, and here, this is the kind of job, you're in the kind of job you should have. So, that was really valuable to me. And I think it kind of boils down to the adage, know thyself. I think people often are they think everybody else is paying really close attention to them, I think. And the reality is everybody, like we all are, everybody's navel gazing. They're just thinking about themselves. They think everyone else is thinking about them, but everyone else is thinking about themselves, just like all of us do. So you can't try to achieve your goals to satisfy others. You have to try to achieve your goals to satisfy yourself, and that really means you need to know what you want. And that can be hard to do, but I certainly encourage students to think about what their needs are, what their wants are, what their desires are. I talked to a student in my office several years ago who wasn't doing well in my class, and I had meetings with all my introductory biology students who were doing poorly in the class. And he said he wasn't interested in college. He wanted to do a trade. And I was impressed that he knew that. I was impressed that he told me that, because I don't need him to stay in my class if he's not going to be happy with the path. He was in college for someone else. He was in college because his parents said, well, give it a try. But what he wanted to do didn't follow that path. So I basically said, I really appreciate your honesty, and, I wish you luck on your path. I think it's fantastic that you know what you want, because so few people do. And, he didn't do very well in the class, and he dropped out of college, as far as I know, and hopefully gone on to a career as an electrician or whatever it was he wanted to do. I don't exactly know. But I was just impressed with his self-knowledge.
Yeah, self-awareness. Yeah, that's good. That's good. But thanks, Mattias, for joining me today. It was so good to have you on as a guest. Thanks for listening. We're glad you were able to tune into this podcast. Once again, this is The New Chemist, where we discuss chemistry, which simply put is the science of change, as well as the other sciences, careers, community, research, and COVID-19. Thanks again for listening. Note, the views on this podcast represent those of my guests and I.